The night air was thick with an eerie stillness as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the narrow, forgotten road. Jimmy, known to millions as Mr. Beast, had no idea why he felt compelled to drive down this particular stretch of road. It was miles away from the bustling city he knew so well, surrounded by dense woods that seemed to close in tighter with every mile. The GPS on his phone had gone haywire hours ago, leaving him to rely on the vague memory of a map he'd glanced at before setting off. He wasn't sure where he was going, only that he had to get there. Fast. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, that something or someone was lurking just beyond the reach of his headlights. He chuckled nervously to himself, trying to push the thought away. He had faced plenty of challenges before, crazy stunts and wild bets that pushed the limits of what anyone thought possible, but this was different. This was a quiet dread that gnawed at the edges of his mind, a feeling that something was terribly wrong. The road wound deeper into the forest, the trees now towering over him like silent sentinels. The pavement turned to gravel, the sound of rocks crunching under the tires echoing through the stillness. Jimmy's knuckles were white as he gripped the steering wheel, his eyes darting from side to side, scanning the darkness for any sign of life. There was none. No animals, no houses, not even the distant hum of another car. Just endless, suffocating silence. And then, as if out of nowhere, he saw a flicker of light in the distance, a small, almost imperceptible glow that seemed to beckon him forward. He hesitated, but the feeling of being drawn to it was too strong to resist. He pressed down on the accelerator, the car jerking forward as it sped towards the light. It grew brighter, revealing itself as the soft, warm glow of a small cottage nestled deep in the woods. Relief washed over him, but it was quickly replaced by a sense of foreboding. He parked the car at the edge of the clearing, the engine sputtering to a stop. As he stepped out, the sound of his shoes crunching on the gravel seemed impossibly loud in the oppressive silence. The cottage looked old, the kind of place that had been standing for centuries, untouched by time or the world around it. The windows were dark, but the light from within spilled out from under the door, casting a strange, shifting pattern on the ground. Jimmy walked up the worn path, his heart pounding in his chest. His hand trembled slightly as he reached for the doorknob, the cold metal sending a shiver up his spine. He paused, every instinct screaming at him to turn back, to leave this place and never return. But something held him there, a force he couldn't name, couldn't understand. He turned the knob slowly, the door creaking open with a sound that made his skin crawl. The light inside was soft, almost inviting, but the air was thick with the smell of dust and something else, something metallic and bitter that he couldn't quite place. The room was small, with old, mismatched furniture that looked like it hadn't been moved in decades. A single candle burned on the table, its flame flickering as if it was being watched by something unseen. "Hello?" Jimmy called out, his voice sounding small and unsure in the empty space. There was no answer. He stepped inside, the floorboards creaking under his weight. The door slammed shut behind him, making him jump. He spun around, but there was no one there. The windows were still dark, the curtains drawn tight. He was alone. Or so it seemed. As he moved further into the room, he noticed something strange, a series of photographs scattered across the table, each one depicting a different person, each one with a face twisted in an expression of sheer terror. His stomach churned as he realized that the faces seemed familiar. They were people he had seen before, in videos, in crowds, in places he couldn't quite place. But the last photo made his blood run cold. It was of him, taken from a distance, his face pale and frightened, just like the others. A cold sweat broke out across his forehead as he backed away from the table, his mind racing. How was this possible? Who took these photos? And why was he here? His breath came in short, ragged gasps as he tried to make sense of it all. But before he could even begin to comprehend what was happening, the candle flickered and went out, plunging the room into darkness. Panic set in as he fumbled for his phone, the light from the screen barely piercing the inky blackness. The room felt smaller now, the walls closing in around him. He could hear something faint, almost imperceptible at first, but growing louder with each passing second. A whisper, a low, guttural sound that sent chills down his spine. It was coming from the shadows, from the darkness that seemed to pulse and writhe around him. He spun around, his phone shaking in his hand, trying to find the source of the sound. But it was everywhere, surrounding him, closing in on him. And then, in the corner of the room, he saw a figure, barely visible in the darkness, standing motionless, watching him. His heart stopped, a scream rising in his throat, but no sound came out. The figure stepped forward, its features slowly coming into focus in the dim light of his phone. It was a man, tall and gaunt, with hollow eyes that seemed to bore into Jimmy's soul. His skin was pale, almost translucent, and his mouth was twisted into a grotesque smile. He wore old, tattered clothes, and his hands were clenched into fists at his sides. But it was his eyes that terrified Jimmy the most, cold, lifeless eyes that held nothing but malice. Who are you?" Jimmy stammered, his voice barely a whisper. The figure didn't respond, just stood there, staring at him with that horrible smile. And then, without warning, it lunged at him, moving with a speed that defied logic. Jimmy screamed, throwing himself backward, but there was nowhere to go. The room seemed to stretch and warp around him, the walls bending and twisting as if they were alive. He scrambled to his feet, his mind screaming at him to run, but his body wouldn't obey. The figure was upon him now, its cold, bony fingers wrapping around his throat, squeezing the life out of him. His vision blurred, darkness closing in as he struggled to breathe, to escape, to survive. But it was no use. The last thing he saw before the world went black was that twisted, malevolent smile, the cold eyes watching him as the life drained from his body. And then there was nothing. When Jimmy awoke, he was lying on the floor, gasping for air. The figure was gone, the room empty and silent once more. But the photos on the table were still there, the faces still twisted in terror. And his face was just as pale and frightened as the others. He stumbled to his feet, his heart racing, his mind spinning. He had to get out of there, had to escape before whatever it was that had attacked him returned. He ran to the door, throwing it open and sprinting out into the night. The cold air hit him like a wall, but he didn't stop. He didn't look back. He just ran until his legs gave out and he collapsed in the middle of the road. The woods were silent once more, the cottage nothing but a distant memory. But the fear, the terror, that would stay with him forever. He had escaped, but he knew that he would never truly be free. The darkness would always be there, lurking just out of sight, waiting for him to let his guard down. And when it did, it would take him, just like it had taken all the others before him. But for now, he was alive. And that was enough. The world outside the cottage seemed normal, almost too normal, as Jimmy staggered down the dark, lonely road. The moonlight barely pierced through the thick canopy of trees, and his breath came in ragged gasps, each exhale forming a cloud of mist in the chilly night air. His mind was still reeling from what he had experienced, from the impossible terror that had gripped him inside that forsaken place. As he walked, the woods around him seemed to come alive with strange sounds, the rustling of leaves, the snapping of twigs, the distant hooting of an owl, all of which seemed to echo with a sinister undertone. Every noise made him jump, his eyes darting around, expecting that ghastly figure to emerge from the shadows at any moment. He tried to focus, to think of a way to get back to safety, back to civilization. But his thoughts were jumbled, his mind unable to fully grasp what had happened. Was it real? Had he actually seen that thing, felt its cold hands around his throat? Or was it just a nightmare, a trick of his exhausted mind? The memories were so vivid, so terrifyingly real, that it was impossible to convince himself otherwise. He reached into his pocket for his phone, his fingers trembling as he pulled it out. The screen was cracked, but it still worked. He tried to open his map app to find out where he was, but the GPS signal was still out of reach. The only thing on the screen was a faint, static-filled image of his own terrified face staring back at him. He recoiled, nearly dropping the phone. But when he looked again, the image was gone, replaced by the familiar home screen. His hands were shaking uncontrollably now. He needed to get help, to call someone, anyone. But as he scrolled through his contacts, every name seemed meaningless, every number a dead end. Who would believe him? Who could possibly understand what he had just gone through? Suddenly, the phone buzzed in his hand, the screen flashing as a new message appeared. It was from an unknown number, and the message was just a single word: run. Jimmy's blood ran cold. He looked around, his heart hammering in his chest. The road was empty, the woods silent except for the rustling of leaves in the breeze. But the feeling of being watched, of something lurking just out of sight, was stronger than ever. He didn't need to be told twice. He turned and ran, the gravel crunching under his feet as he sprinted down the road, his lungs burning with every breath. The forest seemed to close in around him, the trees stretching their gnarled branches out like skeletal fingers, trying to grab him, to pull him back into the darkness. The road ahead was a blur, his vision narrowing as adrenaline pumped through his veins. But no matter how fast he ran, the feeling that something was right behind him, chasing him, never left. His mind raced, filled with a single, desperate thought: escape. But escape to where? There was nothing but endless forest in every direction, no sign of help, no sign of safety. He couldn't keep running forever. His legs were growing weak, his breath coming in ragged gasps. And still, that unseen presence pursued him, relentless, unyielding. Finally, up ahead, he saw a flicker of light through the trees, a glimmer of hope. It was faint, barely visible through the thick undergrowth, but it was there. A house, perhaps, or a car. Something, anything that could offer refuge. He forced himself to run faster, pushing his tired body to the limit as he veered off the road and plunged into the woods, branches whipping at his face, the ground uneven and treacherous beneath his feet. The light grew brighter as he neared it, and soon he could make out the outline of a small, dilapidated building, half hidden among the trees. It wasn't the cottage. This was something different, older, more decayed. The windows were dark, but a single lantern hung by the door, its flame flickering weakly in the night breeze. Jimmy's heart sank as he realized how abandoned it looked, but he had no choice. He was out of time, out of options. He stumbled up to the door, his breath ragged and his body trembling with exhaustion and fear. The door creaked open at his touch, revealing a dark, musty interior. He hesitated for only a moment before stepping inside, his body screaming for rest, for safety. The door creaked shut behind him, the darkness swallowing him whole. The smell of decay and mildew was overpowering, and the floorboards groaned under his weight. He fumbled for the light switch, but there was none. Only darkness, thick and suffocating, pressing in on him from all sides. He moved deeper into the building, his hands outstretched, feeling his way through the pitch-black room. The air was cold, almost frigid, and his breath came out in visible puffs. But there was something else too, something that made his skin crawl, that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. It was the feeling that he wasn't alone. As his eyes adjusted to the darkness, he could make out vague shapes in the room, old furniture covered in dust, the remnants of a fireplace long unused. But in the far corner, something else caught his eye. A figure, hunched over, unmoving, its back turned to him. Jimmy froze, every muscle in his body tensing with fear. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound, but he could feel its presence, a cold, malevolent energy that filled the room. He opened his mouth to speak, to call out, but no sound came. His throat was dry, his voice stolen by the overwhelming terror that gripped him. The figure slowly turned its head, its movements unnatural, almost mechanical. And then he saw at those same hollow, lifeless eyes, the twisted smile that had haunted his nightmares, staring back at him from the shadows. Jimmy staggered backward, his heart racing, his mind screaming at him to run, to get out of there. But before he could move, the figure spoke, its voice a low, rasping whisper that sent chills down his spine. "You shouldn't have come here," it said, its eyes never leaving his. "Now, you belong to us." Jimmy turned and bolted for the door, his hands fumbling for the handle in the darkness. He threw it open and burst out into the night, the cold air hitting him like a wave. He didn't stop to look back, didn't dare to see if the figure was following him. He just ran, his legs pumping, his breath ragged, his mind consumed by a single thought: escape. But the woods were different now, twisted and unfamiliar, the path he had taken lost in the darkness. The trees seemed to move, to shift around him, blocking his way, leading him in circles. No matter which way he turned, he ended up back at the same spot, the same cursed building looming in the shadows. Exhaustion was setting in, his legs heavy, his chest burning. He couldn't keep this up. He had to find a way out, had to escape before it was too late. But the woods offered no escape, no refuge. The darkness was alive, pulsing with an energy that he could feel in his bones, a presence that was watching him, waiting for him to tire, to give up. Finally, he collapsed to the ground, his body trembling with exhaustion and fear. The building stood before him, dark and foreboding, its windows like empty eyes staring down at him. The lantern by the door flickered, its light growing dimmer, weaker, until it finally went out, plunging everything into darkness. Jimmy lay there, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps, his mind a blur of fear and despair. He could feel the darkness closing in around him, suffocating him, pulling him down into its depths. And then, just as he was about to give in, to let the darkness take him, he saw a faint glow in the distance, far off through the trees. Hope flared in his chest, weak but persistent. He forced himself to his feet, his legs shaking, his body screaming in protest. The light was distant, barely more than a pinprick in the darkness, but it was there. He stumbled towards it, his steps unsteady, his vision blurring. The woods seemed to fight him, the trees closing in, the ground shifting beneath his feet. But he pushed forward, driven by a desperate need to escape, to survive. The light grew brighter as he neared it, and soon he could see that it wasn't a house or a car, but something else entirely, a large, open clearing bathed in an unnatural, almost ethereal light. He emerged from the trees, the sudden openness startling after the oppressive forest, and stumbled into the clearing. It was empty, save for a single, solitary figure standing in the center, bathed in the strange light. Jimmy's heart skipped a beat as he recognized the figure. It was the same one he had seen in the cottage, in the building, the same hollow eyes and twisted smile. But this time, it was different. This time, it was waiting for him. "Why are you doing this?" Jimmy managed to choke out, his voice barely more than a whisper. His body was shaking, his mind a blur of terror and confusion. The figure didn't respond, just stood there, watching him with those cold, lifeless eyes. Jimmy took a step back, then another, his mind racing for a way out. But the figure moved with him, mirroring his every move. He was trapped, the clearing offering no escape, no refuge. And then, the figure spoke, its voice cold and emotionless. "You were chosen," it said, its eyes never leaving his. "You were always meant to come here." Jimmy shook his head, his mind reeling. "Chosen for what?" he demanded, his voice rising in desperation. "Why me?" The figure tilted its head, as if considering the question. "Because you seek to challenge fate," it said slowly, its smile widening. "You think you can control everything, that you are invincible. But here, in this place, you are nothing. You are just another pawn in the game." Jimmy's heart pounded in his chest, his fear turning to anger. "This is insane," he spat, his voice trembling. "I didn't ask for this. I just wanted to get out, to survive." The figure's smile faded, its expression growing serious. "There is no escape," it said quietly, its voice like ice. "You belong to this place now. You will never leave." Jimmy's breath caught in his throat, a cold dread settling in his chest. "No," he whispered, shaking his head. "No, I won't let you take me. I won't give up." The figure's eyes narrowed, its expression darkening. "You don't have a choice," it said, its voice cold and final. "This is your fate." Jimmy took a step back, his mind racing. There had to be a way out, some way to break free from this nightmare. He couldn't let it end like this, couldn't let himself be consumed by the darkness. And then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw a faint glimmer of light at the edge of the clearing, barely visible through the trees. It was small, almost imperceptible, but it was there. Hope flared in his chest once more, and he took another step back, his eyes locked on the light. The figure moved closer, its presence overwhelming, suffocating. But Jimmy didn't stop, didn't let the fear consume him. He turned and ran, sprinting towards the light, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his legs burning with exhaustion. The trees closed in around him, the darkness pressing down on him from all sides. But the light was growing brighter, stronger, guiding him through the twisted forest. He could hear the figure behind him, its footsteps echoing through the night, but he didn't look back. He couldn't. The light was just ahead now, so close he could almost touch it. He reached out, his fingers brushing against the cool, glowing surface. And then, with a sudden burst of energy, he broke through the trees and into the light. The world exploded in a blinding flash of white, and for a moment, Jimmy felt weightless, as if he were floating in a void. The sounds of the forest faded away, replaced by a deep, resounding silence. He closed his eyes, his body trembling with exhaustion and fear, and waited for whatever came next. When he opened his eyes, he was standing in the middle of an empty street, the familiar sounds of the city around him. The light was gone, the forest a distant memory. He was back in the real world, back where he belonged. But something was different. The air was thick with a sense of unease, the streets deserted, the buildings dark and foreboding. The city felt wrong, twisted, as if it were only a shadow of the place he had known. And then he realized the darkness had followed him. He looked down at his hands, trembling with fear. His skin was pale, almost translucent, just like the figure in the forest. The cold, hollow feeling was back, creeping up from the depths of his soul. He could feel it, the darkness, seeping into him, consuming him from the inside out. He turned and ran, his footsteps echoing through the empty streets, but no matter where he went, the darkness was always there, lurking just out of sight, waiting for him to tire, to give in. And in the distance, just out of reach, he could hear it, the low, rasping voice of the figure, whispering his name, calling him back to the place where it all began. The place where he belonged. Jimmy's heart pounded in his chest, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps as he ran through the empty streets, the darkness closing in around him. He knew now that there was no escape, no way to break free from the nightmare that had consumed him. The darkness was a part of him, and it would never let him go. And so he ran, endlessly, desperately, through the twisted city, his mind consumed by a single, terrifying thought. He was lost, forever trapped in the darkness, with no way out. And the figure, with its hollow eyes and twisted smile, watched him from the shadows, waiting for the moment when he would finally give up, when he would finally let the darkness take him. Because in the end, there was no escape. There was only the darkness, and it was always waiting.